So our speaker today is Benjamin Iten. Benjamin is a humanist chaplain with the American Humanist Association. He's earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Jewish Studies at the Ohio State University, and he's a Master of Divinity from the Methodist School of Ohio. He completed his CPA internship and residency with the OhioHealth, including a second-year residency in palliative care. He currently functions as a staff chaplain for OhioHealth, as well as a certified educator candidate. The title of his talk is Religion Really Evil? A Humanist Chaplain Reflects on Interfaith Work. And I'll let Ben take it from here. Ben?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so as Alex mentioned, I'm a humanist chaplain, and I'm now a certified educator, and I work as a chaplain Monday through Friday and as a certified educator. So I train chaplains as well in their work in the hospital, hospice settings, and we're in the process of expanding, placing some chaplains in shelters for people experiencing homelessness, some transition housing, that sort of thing. So the question might be, why does a humanist chaplain who does not believe in God, I often, when I'm interviewing students who are largely theistics, I kind of describe myself as saying, I don't believe in God, but I believe in you. And I'll let you decide what that means for your discernment whether or not you want to work with me for a year. That's usually how much time I work with students. And so why would a humanist chaplain, a chaplain who personally does not believe in God, wants to expand the role of chaplains into all of these different spaces? Isn't that just putting spirituality, religion, Christianity even into spaces where maybe religion, Christianity, and spirituality in general maybe shouldn't be? And the reason I do this is in part because I think the answer to my intentionally provocative question of is religion really evil is it depends. And it depends on a few things. It depends on what we're talking about. If we're on the one hand, we can look at this globally. And by doing so, we can look at this historically. Religion in general has been the root of so many wars and violent acts, right? The traditional sort of go-to point of reference is even as early as the Crusades. We can talk about Emperor Constantine becoming a Christian and using the cross in his kind of expansion of the Roman Empire. The confluence of Christianity in particular with politics, really starting before then, but kind of solidifying ever since then. We can look to the history of Islam and the jihads that have been motivated through one's belief in Islam. And we can point that even to as recent as our modern day interactions or experiences, violence committed in the name of Islam, such as 9/11, various other terror attacks across not just America, but the globe. We could connect Christianity to the ever expansion of colonialism into the Western world. If you were to read the wonderful book by Khyati Joshi called White Christian Privilege, last name is Joshi, White Christian Privilege, he does a very good job of pointing out the interrelationship in America in particular of religion, Christianity in particular, and racism, our racist system that exists within the America, and the slave system, the capitalism, from if we were to be sort of critique capitalism as well. And so we can point to all of these different ways. We could go to Nazism, and I had a very good friend in seminary whose history of religion, Christianity paper he took. He pointed out point by point how Hitler cribbed a lot of Luther's own writings and his anti-Semitism and justifying the horrific acts that Hitler did under the Nazis. And so if we were to point to all of that, if we were to point to all of these larger global structures, it is easy, and I would say justifiably so, to point to religion and say, yes, it is evil. And that way I would agree with folks such as Stephen Fry, who just would blanketly critique religion as an evil in the world, and may religion, that religion as it is manifested in that way, be done away with. However, when we look at other studies, and then we start looking into sort of psychological studies, neurological studies, well-being studies, when we move out from a sort of global look at things and we look at how religion has impacts on the individual, though, there seems to be some pretty significant evidence that religion, to one form or another, actually has some pretty positive effects. Religion has been connected to all sorts of positive emotions. The more religious you are, the more likely you are to feel hope, to feel optimism, to be more resilient in the face of trauma. The more religious you are, the more connected you are to having a meaningful life, living a meaningful life, finding meaning and purpose from your life. More religious you are, the less likely you are to die by suicide. We could get into the moralization of suicide. It's often the conversation I have. If you are religious, according to these aren't just one studies. These are hundreds and hundreds of studies, not even dozens of studies. If you are religious, you will tend to live longer. I would ask the question, is living longer really the goal, though? Do I want to live longer? What does the end of one's life look like? And so if we start looking at religion from that side of things, I would argue that perhaps religion isn't necessarily evil. I myself have some pretty traumatic experiences with religion. I was raised in a fundamentalist church. I am essentially the first person in my family not to go to Bob Jones University, if you're familiar with that tradition of things, in South Carolina. I was in an abusive spiritual community, what I often refer to as a cult, which I believe was a cult, a Christian-based cult, for 10 years of my life, from the age of 19 to 29, experiencing, I would say, weekly, if not daily, spiritual abuse in that space of things. So even on the individual level, I want to put a caveat here, and that not all religion is necessarily helpful. Not all spiritual communities are necessarily helpful. When religion is used to stoke things such as shame, not particularly helpful. When religion is used to manipulate and control people, I would say we're using religion as an evil in the world. But religion does not necessarily have to be used that way. And this is kind of where I reflect then on my experience as a chaplain. I don't deal with religion on a regular basis with these sort of historical global evils of things. I work with patients and students in the midst of grief and traumatic situations, in the midst of changing what it means to be in the world. And what I have come to learn, what I have come to realize through my experiences is what was abusive to me is not necessarily abusive to other folks, and that other folks actually find a lot of resiliency in their religious tradition. And so, but this raises the question, and I'm using this language intentionally. The research, if we complicate the research a little bit, it starts equating religion and spirituality. So we have to ask the question, are those really the same? What do we mean by religion? What do we mean by spirituality? And if you notice, when I'm summarizing the benefits of religion, I'm talking about religion. I'm not talking about spirituality. There is recent work that is coming out within the last couple years that is flipping the spiritual but not religious language on its head and saying, what does it mean to be religious but not spiritual? Essentially, can one, as I believe it is the French philosopher Alain de Botton, in his little book of atheist spirituality, who identifies himself as a Christian atheist. He identifies himself as a religious person, but not spiritual. He finds lots of meaning, and he seeks to derive the benefits from religion. That is optimism, that is hope, that is community, that is a meaningfully lived life from religion without the belief in any sort of supernatural, whether it is the Western monotheistic God or the various deities and their representations in Hinduism, or if we were the various tribes of Africa, or ancestor worship. But he would argue, and here we start to get into where I would agree, that one could be religious and not spiritual, that one can derive the benefits of religion without having to believe in God. We don't even have to go to church, don't have to go to synagogue, don't have to go to the mosque. But we can have the benefits of religion. We can live a religious life without being spiritual. Let me stop there and just see if we have any questions or comments on that piece of things. Alex, you're muted. If you're talking into your mic, I can't hear you. I see the camera turning in on you.
There. I'm here. Can you hear me?
I got you.
Okay. What was I going to ask? All the important notes are on napkins. I keep thinking, I hear from politicians, they speak about faith as a virtue, and I'm wondering, what do they mean by that? Did they really mean believing what you're expected to believe, or is there some other interpretation of that phrase?
Yeah, I think that's a loaded language. And I can't tell you to what the politicians mean by it. I would disagree that faith is a virtue. It depends on what you put that faith in, and how solidly you hold on to that faith. I have seen people put their faith in God in the midst of tragedy, and it's brought them peace. So it is, so at one point, I was working at the hospital, and a gentleman in his 50s came in as a trauma 1. So that is the most severe level of trauma. He was unresponsive. What was happening was he was working in his house doing some construction, some DIY in his attic. He he missed one of the joists and fell through the attic wall flat onto his chest about 10 feet down. He was deeply Catholic. His family was Catholic. And when they brought him to us, the hospital, despite all of their best efforts, their best energies, could not bring him back to life. He died in our trauma bay. The family got there and understandably grief-stricken, tearful, wondering why this would happen. Why would God let this happen? I myself, and I train my chaplains, we do not answer that question. Cannot tell them why that would happen. In my mind, there is no why ultimately, as far as divine providence in that space of things. I don't believe in the divine, let alone in some sort of providence of that divine. But ultimately, that's up to the patients and the family members to decide why. As I was journeying with his wife, and his wife in particular in that space of things, we do not answer the why in the trauma. It often takes years or months at the very least to figure out one's why as to why something might happen, why they, giving meaning, I would say, to that situation. But what she found comfort in was she believed that God had a purpose for everything. While she did not understand the purpose, for her, there was comfort in that moment to trust that there was some sort of purpose in it. It gave her peace, it let her drive home safely. I honestly don't know what happens to folks once they leave the hospital. My experience with many different people is that likely she did, she found some way of creating meaning out of that space that she connected to God's purpose in her life. I hope so. Her religion and her spirituality in that moment brought her peace. We also called a priest. Now, the priest is not supposed to do what we call last rites, but is really called the anointing for the sick to people who are already dead, because it is anointing for the sick. Once you're dead, you're no longer sick. You're dead. But this was very meaningful to the patient's wife, that the deceased wife, that this happened. And so the priest came in, and not all priests are willing to be flexible in this way, but he came in and understanding it as a point of comfort for the wife. He provided last rites to her husband who had already died. She found comfort in that. Now, we could argue if she didn't believe in hell, she wouldn't need the comfort of last rites. Fair enough. But she did, and religion brought her peace in that moment. So I think when we're looking in these day-to-day basis, what one puts one's faith in can be a virtue, can bring peace. Does one necessarily have to live an ethical, does someone who believes in the divine necessarily live an ethical life? I think we can obviously say no. Does someone who are atheists able to live ethical lives? Obviously, yes. A topic for another conversation, maybe. But when it comes to, is faith a virtue, we have to ask, what do you mean by faith and what do you mean by virtue? I would think in that case of that I just presented, her faith in the rituals, her faith in God's purpose brought her peace, and to me, peace is a virtue.
I see a couple hands up on
I
Zoom.
think Dana's was up first.
Yes, Dana?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't quite clear on when you said to be able to be religious without spiritual.
Yeah.
Okay, now the story that you just told certainly was a good example of that in a way.
Yeah.
But I kind of thought maybe you had to be faithful to religion without spirituality. They're going to be kind of A, B, C, 1, 2, 3 kind of.
Yeah. So that's really great, Dana. I mean, that depends on what we're defining religion as. What are religious markers? So I would argue that if you are part of a humanist community, you are participating religiously, whether you realize it or not. Community of people gathered around shared values and mutual support. Those are when we look at those studies that show the positive results of religion, that it is not the belief or the lack of belief in God necessarily, although we'll talk a little bit about ways that gets complicated, but it is these sorts of other things, community, shared values, ways and means that we might have direction in our lives, that these things do not necessarily require gods, but we can still have the religious component to it. A set calendar is also very important to human resilience. I think secularly we have gotten rid of, I think to our benefit to one degree, of the religious calendar of things. Nevertheless, I encourage my community, and I try to mark these sorts of what I think of scientific parts of our calendar, equinoxes and solstices and Darwin Day and other sort of secular things that might mark time passing so that it does not just go by without some sort of intentionality. These, I think, are religious components that do not necessarily need supernatural deities or fairies or the ancestors involved in order to get those benefits. Larry, the French philosopher I mentioned, who actually talks a lot about this, is Alain, A-L-A-N-D-E, Botton, B-O-T-T-O-N.
Okay, David, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, and Ben, I think you addressed this somewhat in your last answer, but I wanted to talk about where you mentioned community as something linked to religion, and I was thinking of a couple that I knew who had been members of a Unitarian Universalist congregation and really didn't find community in that, but later on found community in their work for the local Democratic Party. And that was a way of working in a way to further the values they had. But one doesn't tend to think of a political party as being a religion. But in their case, it really was a source of community for them.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example. When I think of secular communities, even beyond like humanism or the Unitarian Universalists or the Democratic Party, I had a person I bumped into through an acquaintance who was an atheist, didn't believe in God, didn't join the humanist community, didn't go to the UU church, wasn't a part of any particular atheist community, but he found his community in the local biking community, like bicycling. And those were his people, man. And when he got sick with cancer, those people stepped up for him. They brought him food. They took him to the doctor's visits. They sat with him when he was getting his cancer treatments. When he transitioned to hospice, these were the people who sat with him in hospice. His family had rejected him because of his atheism and didn't want anything to do with him. But this bicycling community gathered around this guy as he was dying, and some of the local musicians as well. And that was his community. That was his people. He found purpose and meaning in life in the charitable things that community did. They didn't just bicycle. They did things like Peloton. They did things like other local events where they gave back to our Columbus, Ohio community. And so for him, that was, I would argue, that was a religious community. If we distinguish, if we require divinity for religion, we're going to start knocking off sort of Buddhism at its core as a religious tradition. We're going to start knocking off, there are other religious traditions that don't necessarily require the divine in order to be a religious tradition. But who still gather. You can practice mindfulness without believing in God. Sam Harris has a great book on different mindfulness practices from an atheist perspective. These are ways that religion can provide us benefits without the divine.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to remind people, when you're done speaking or when you start speaking, lower your hand. That's done under the reactions button as well. So this way we can keep track of people. Anyway, I had one question which has always bothered me over time. And that is how so many humanists hate religion to such a degree that they cannot even talk about it. I mean, it's really something. And I was wondering if you had any insight into that.
Yeah, I think it's because we, by and large, bring our own baggage. I think when we think religion, we think this global experience of things. We've seen religion, in particular Christianity, conservative Christianity, play out incredibly powerfully negative in America. And when we think religion, that's what we go to. When we think of religion, we think of the Crusades, we think of 9/11, we think of jihadists, we think of, let's get the Buddhists in here. We may not realize that the violence that happened in Tamil from the Tamil Tigers were Buddhists fighting Muslims. There are all sorts of ways that religion creates violence. And so I think that is what we react to. And many of us are like me. Most people are not born into humanism. Most people aren't born into atheism. We tend to deconvert. And that tends to be a painful process. Maybe there is some religious and spiritual trauma in that process of things. And so it takes a lot of work to kind of put some of that pain to the side and go, maybe there's some benefit here, and not just react so negatively to the pain that we have felt or experienced. Honestly, it took me 5-6 years of therapy and clinical pastoral education to work through some of my own religious trauma and knee-jerk reaction to not want to talk about religion.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned about community. That's just one aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Can you define religion, spirituality, and humanism? What other aspects of it, and how you define those groups?
Yeah. So Greg has put all sorts of links that I've not been able to follow in the chat, so I'm not sure what all of those wonderful things might say, but let me talk from my side of things. Generally, when we're looking at spirituality, I'm talking that I'm talking when we're looking at the research side of things, they conflate religion and spirituality. But for me, spirituality is living a meaningful life. I would argue we wouldn't have to be religious. We don't have to be divine to live a spiritual life. See previous talks that I think I've given to you folks. But I think in general, when we're thinking spirituality, when we think of the spiritual, we think of we think of the divine, the spiritual, the non-tangible things, that piece of things. When we think of religion, especially when we look at the research, when the religion is looking at is trying to carve out these supernatural space of things and go, okay, religion is sort of the practice of these things. So prayer or mindfulness, attending, being a part and engaged in a regular community, gathering, service to others. These sorts of things are religious. If we're going into the spiritual realm of things, where I might say something like humanism might be able to live into a secular spirituality, would be things like, I think we have ways of offering people, we don't tell them how to make meaning from their lives, but I think, offer a pathway to help people find meaning in their lives. That to me is a spiritual discipline versus a religious discipline. It's not an action per se. That is the religious side of things, but it is an internal sort of belief of oneself. So if we were to talk about secularly spiritual side of things, that's what I would talk about. But spiritual in the research also kind of talks more about these demarcations of the divine, of the supernatural. That's when we start to get into the spiritual side of things. Humanism, for me, I like the way that the Humanist Manifesto, the third Humanist Manifesto, and I think the way Alex described it, is a philosophy of life. That seems to be less baggage than religious. We could ask the difference. What's the difference between a religion and a philosophy of life? But humanism, to me, helps people to set boundaries to their path for creating the meaning out of their lives. And so we do this generally through science and reason, through observation. What I also like about the third Humanist Manifesto, Humanism and Its Aspirations, is it doesn't, it allows for different varieties of human experiences, as far as like the arts and other things that might expose us to other ways of knowing that we're not quite understanding just yet. What I think that places like when I'm talking to my Christian students, or my Jewish students, or my Muslim students, what I reiterate to them is that for me, when I'm looking and I'm thinking scientifically, or I'm looking at something humanistically, when I get to something that I don't know, or that has reached the balance of science, I don't go, well, there's God, right? God of the gaps does not exist for me. When I reach to the boundaries of science and our current knowledge of things, I go, that's cool, let's learn some more. That to me is a humanist perspective versus a kind of more traditional theistic perspective of things that might say, well, that must be where God is. If we can't answer a question, we have reached the end of our current human understanding of things. That doesn't mean there is nothing there beyond that space.
Zem, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk. You mentioned different characteristics, I guess, that people of faith have, that they live longer, that their suicide rates are lower. In my life, I observed something, and I don't know if research bears this out or not, but I noticed that religious people are, how to put it politely, less nice to other people than people in general. And I experienced this repeatedly. And, is this something, is it just me? Or is there something to this?
The way I like to phrase it is that not nice people like to use religion. So I think I don't know of any particular study off the top of my head, though you ask a very good question. If I'm speaking anecdotally, and from my own experience of things, I would say yes, I've seen religious people be not nice, and mean and spiteful. I've also seen religious people motivated from their faith and their religion doing some really amazing things. My internal bias is that people who are nice will do nice things and they will cloak it in their faith and religion. And people who are not nice, who maybe did not learn to share, did not listen to Robert Fulghum, everything he learned in kindergarten. They also use religion to justify the mean things that they do, the spiteful things that they do. But I don't know of any sort of particular study that connects one to the other, honestly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Marty.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I guess I like to keep it more simple with regard to definitions with religion and spirituality. I've always read that religion is defined as the belief in the supernatural, and growing up in the 60s and the following decades, it was very common for everybody to say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And so the definition became very loose, but generally speaking, it seemed like people were searching, for meaning and love in their life, and they wanted to do good things, quote, virtuous things. And that's all great. But they might not believe in God, or they may believe in God, but not follow a religion's dictates with regard to ritual. So that to me was a distinction. You mentioned that, if we define religion as a belief in the supernatural, then you might have to omit Buddhism, for example. And I would sort of concur. Buddhism is more of a philosophy than a religion, although, it was intended to be just a philosophy. I think that's what the Buddha intended. I heard a rumor that when the Buddha was questioned about God, he says, what difference does it make? People are starving, and we got to take care of each other. And that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But when I went to Tibet and to Bhutan and Cambodia, their temples are filled with drawings of deities, and they're bowing down to the Buddha, and they say they're not worshiping idols, but it sure looks like it. and like one, some people told me, yeah, they go to the Buddha, they pray to win the lottery, and everything else. Yeah. It's interesting. But I one person I spoke with explained this to me, and it seemed to make sense, that originally Buddhism, had nothing to do with God, essentially. But the people who were adopting Buddhism and wanted to incorporate their pagan beliefs. And so that's how you have all these deities and everything. And that made sense. And we see that, with many religions, in Christianity, with Christmas, everybody knows that story. Yeah. So, so I guess to me, you could say, like this guy with the bicycle club, and I'm all for it. I bicycled across America and spent 5 months bicycling through Europe, but none of the people I knew will come visit me. But that's my problem, not theirs. Okay, so people belong to all kinds of organizations, meet up, whatever it might be. And they might get a spiritual connection out of that, but there's no reason, I think, to call it a religious thing, and unless you start worshiping some of the people in the group or something. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, I mean, all that's fair enough. I think my general pushback is that we have religious type this question of, I think what we talked about, somebody asked in the larger group meeting there is like, we can get these religious benefits, and that's kind of from these other places. And that religion itself is not, to the question of the day, is religion necessarily evil, or is it really evil? I think there are benefits to religious spaces of things that I think we can get those benefits. And so that's kind of why I half tongue in cheek say it's a religious community. But I also, when I'm working with my students, they come back and they present a case study and they're like, I didn't have a spiritual conversation with this patient, and I need to know why. I need to have, how I could have broken through and gotten to a spiritual conversation with this patient. Meanwhile, when you look at the visit, what the student did was they spent 45 minutes with this person talking to them about home and why they missed home so much, and who are the important people at home, including their dog, and how they were worried about their dog and had anxiety and concern about their dog. Those people, that particular person, found meaning, found spiritual religious benefit from these mundane secular spaces of things. My message to my students is you actually had a very spiritual conversation with this person. You connected with them emotionally and meaningfully, and you helped them process some of their grief of being in a hospital for 2 weeks while their dog is at home, and who knows what's happening at at home. And so those can be pretty strong spiritual conversations, or if you would like, strong religious conversations. I think part of my goal is to sort of complicate this conversation a little bit, and that these lines that we like to think of as being pretty clear are not always so clear.
Yeah, I just want to add that I believe in God, but I'm not religious. And by that, I mean, that I don't obey the rituals, even though I believe in the religion. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wanted to get into some other data actually a little bit, and then maybe we can see what Oded and Michael have to add to the conversation if I can. We got some raised hands here. I don't want to ignore them. Or let's do Oded and Michael, and then I'll digress into some more data.
Okay, Oded.
Okay, after unmute. Okay, I can talk now. Okay, what you say religion is, you say all the religions are the same. You use one word. Like saying all the ism, like communism, capitalism, humanism, all the ism is one ism. So religion is not the same. Every religion have its own plus and minus. Therefore I say when you talk about religion, you have to be specific. And in each religion, you have different stream. In Christianity, you have very humanistic group, and there is very bad group. So I think putting religion as one entity is not right. You have to be specific.
Yeah, very good. I appreciate that complication, Oded.
Okay. Secondly,
yep.
You say, some people say, who killed the people, the gun or the bad guys? Familiar with this question. So what I believe, again, maybe religion, that the bad people is the one that's using the gun. It's not the gun that use the bad people. So the same true about religion. How you implement the religion, how people, the bad evil people, use religion as a way to kill other people, right? This is the people issue, is not the religious issue. So you have to separate between people and religion.
Yeah, I think,
That's all.
yeah, thank Odette. I think it's a bit of overly simple analogy of religion to weapons. Religion, I think, does have some motivational effect in people's lives. But I think there is something to your point there. And there's a book by Stephen Prothero, which I take exception to for all sorts of different reasons, but the underlying argument of God is not one, is that, Islam has a different understanding of God than Christianity, than Judaism, like all of these different traditions don't actually, when you look down to the nitty-gritties of things, they disagree on what God looks like. And to homogenize those differences is actually not helpful and kind of erases kind of important distinctions. Not that one way of understanding God is better than the other, but that these distinctions are different. I think that underlying argument is good. The rest of the book is awful, but that underlying argument I tend to agree with. But when we are looking, though, at what some of these commonalities of religion, again, community, being together in community, the studies have been complicated to show that whether that is a religious community now or a secular community. There's a wonderful article called Why Believing in God with Other People, in parentheses, is good for your health. Why not believing in God is with other people is good for your health. And essentially it is the community aspect of things that is good for your health, not the believing in God in and of itself. I'm digressing into where I want to go, but I want to pull myself back to Michael real fast.
Yeah, Michael, and this will be Zim and Bill. We'll get back to you after Benjamin explained. So, Michael.
Yes, thank you for this talk. I'm very much with you in your acknowledgement of this positive sides of religion along with negative. And I'm wondering, do you see the application of this position to what motivates to large degree our political and ideological divisions? Because they, at least partly, they are among the different religions or between religious and secular people. And I'm less familiar with religious people, so I have to acknowledge it. But I see that in liberal or / progressive camp, there is a lot of contempt directed to conservatives. And based on this perception that they are sort of evangelical nuts, and so what to talk about? So it's just the conversation stops. And I guess there is also some negativity and distrust from religious people to liberals. That is sort of ironic because one of the liberal values is the tolerance, and including the religious tolerance. And I guess what happens that any strong ideology, religious or not, makes people less tolerant. And how to overcome this, I'm wondering about your thoughts about it.
Yeah, that's good. I don't know of any research that connects particularly. I think secular identities are manifested all over the American political spectrum of things. I think in a previous talk I gave to your folks, my experience of humanism is that people seem to be either far left-leaning liberals and or and I don't want to digress into the conversation of like false binary. I acknowledge this is a false binary, but far left-leaning liberals or libertarians, like, so like either these seems to be the extreme sort of ways that humanism represents itself politically. There's, in my experience, at least in Columbus, Ohio, there are very few moderate secular identities who are moderately political. But I think you are right in the sense that we can vilify evangelicals for a variety of reasons. I don't think they're within the evangelical community. There's many reasons to critique and to be in opposition to. Nevertheless, I know some really wonderful evangelical Christians who would do really wonderful things, who give to the poor, who vote Democrat, who might even vote Green Party from their foundations. I don't know of any particular study that predicts one's political leaning or connects or even correlates one's religious identity with one's political identity. I think that there are representations from all sides of the political spectrum in those spaces of things. But what I wanted to connect us to real quickly is this idea that so the research has continued to when it comes to sort of health outcomes and the benefits of things, is that when you start then saying things like people started critiquing them and pointing out that the research that was happening was going Christianity versus Islam versus atheists. Well, that's a bit of a false equivalency, and that atheism is not necessarily a way of life, a religion. It is a statement about God. Again, Alain de Botton would say, "I am an atheist and I am Christian." So they started then going at theism versus atheism. And when you compare those two things, things start to even out a little bit, especially if you look at the different ways that people then live their lives intentionally. If an atheist finds community in certain places, these health disparities even out a little bit. When we look at research on atheism in particular, then we could start asking questions. Is there negative health outcomes for being atheist connected to microaggressions, biases against atheism? Being an atheist is one of the last great bastions of cultural disdain. People will be more bothered if somebody brought an atheist home to meet the parents than somebody from a different tradition. More people are less likely to vote for an atheist who's running for a political party. When you look at biases and they say, here's this person who did this horrible thing, is it more likely that they are a teacher and an atheist? They would say, oh, it's more likely that they're a teacher and an atheist than they are a teacher. That's not the right answer. If you look at, circles of probability, it is more likely that they are the larger portion of things a teacher. So these microaggressions, as we've seen in other sorts of identities, such as not saying they're the moral equivalent of, say, racism or homophobia, heterosexism, that sort of thing. But when we look at the negative health effects of, say, the anxiety and shame that comes from being in the closet, if you're a part of the LGBTQ community, there are correlations between the similar things if you're in an atheist closet. So there's actually health benefits to being out as a secular person, rather than not being out as a secular person. And so we then start looking at, there's been a few studies, so I'm going to start talking with less certainty, but there have been a few studies that seem to suggest that the question is not actually whether or not one believes in God, but how strongly one believes in God. So if you are a strong theist, and you are a strong atheist, your health outcomes tend to even out and be comparable. If you are one of those spiritual but not religious people in the middle who may not have a solid understanding of one's own purpose or theology or understanding of the world, then your health outcomes start becoming more negative, actually. So the spiritual but not religious seem to be the people that have less health outcomes than whether or not one is theistic or atheistic. And some of the guesses around those sorts of things is actually kind of the things that Marty, you pointed out to. When people leave the religious tradition, they tend to hold on to a theistic understanding of the world, which is fine, but they lose some of the religious components that seem to be beneficial to person's health. They left religion, and so they find community anywhere to kind of take the place of that space of things. They stop believing in a personal God or a God who will answer prayer or a value of prayer, and they don't replace it necessarily with some sort of mindfulness practice. That seems to weigh off some of, create the similar health benefits, maybe even more health benefits than prayer. So when we are looking then at some of these health outcomes, we're looking at some of these religious space of things, it is actually not, again, it's not the whether or not one believes in God, but how one lives their lives and how one finds then these religiously positive or these positive experiences that we tend to connect with religion. Those tend to have a better health outcomes. We also have bias in the research in assuming that a long life is necessarily what we want. I don't know if that is necessarily what I want. It is moralizing death by suicide. There are studies that seem to point out that the more traditional your understanding of the heaven and hell and the afterlife, the more aggressive health treatments you seek out. And so your life tends to be prolonged. If you have a secular identity, you're going to probably move to comfort care, that is hospice and end-of-life care, faster than a religiously traditional person. That's going to mean your life is probably going to be shorter. But for me, that's because how I die is as important as how I live. And I don't want to suffer while I die because there is no meaning to me in the suffering. More than likely. I mean, you could take the Christopher Hitchens route, who signed up for medical research to further scientific research into his particular cancer that took his life. That prolonged his suffering. He found meaning out of that prolonging suffering. But if you have a secular identity, you're probably going to go to comfort care faster. And that's fine, but that means you're going to live a shorter life. But if you have a health outcome, which means that living longer is necessarily good and not living longer is necessarily bad, that's going to bias some of this research, right? The questions that they're the assumptions that they're asking to a certain extent are faulty. But when we start taking account some of that level of differences of things, the way different traditions might approach death and dying, and whether or not one might see living longer as a good or a bad, we start to see some of these differences evening out. So by gathering together, you are prolonging your life. Well done. If you have a mindfulness practice, you are likely prolonging your life. Well done. If you secular people tend to exercise more, you're going to prolong your life if you exercise more. So well done on that, if you're a part of a secular identity. So those are some of the things that I wanted to point out to as well in the research, that it is not, there are significant levels of, like, hundreds and hundreds of research articles and done over thousands and thousands of people that seem to connect religious practices with better health outcomes. In particular, mental health. There's fewer articles, fewer research has been done, less research has been done on sort of physical health outcomes, although it does seem to suggest that people who are religious have some health outcome benefits as well, such as lower rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer. But that research is younger and a little murkier. So, and I just wanted to make sure we got that in our time today as well, to kind of complicate things up a little bit.
Okay, Zem.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about religion as a coping mechanism. You mentioned that people turn to religion in times, in difficult times, that religion is comforting, which makes total sense to me, that would be the case. But I'm wondering, is there a secular version of this? And the reason I ask is because, I've had rough patches in my life. I'm sure I'll have more rough patches in my life. But at no point was I tempted to suspend rationality. Like, I'm going to be irrational for the next 3 months, and I'm going to believe in God. And then when things return to normal, I'll be an atheist again. I just, do not imagine that happening. I mean, I'm an atheist 24/7, 365 days a year. So, the question then becomes, how does one comfort oneself? Because religion, you can see there's a sort of a teleology, there is a purpose maybe to your suffering. Like Jesus dying on the cross. But what is the secular approach to all this, difficult situations like that?
Yeah, you're asking the $1 million question there, my friend. I think there is a secular approach to it. And I think it comes from each individual in that particular case. And that there is, to my knowledge and understanding of things as it currently is, the way I work at it, the way I look at it, is through the stories we tell. And I think that is, for me, the easiest, most direct way of creating some sort of secular meaning and comfort out of the suffering that we may be experiencing. I root a lot of my chaplaincy practice in narrative theory, coming out of Michael White and neuro-narrative projects as well, kind of looking at some of the neurology of things. And that is just the question of my story is more than what is happening now. The way I approach what is happening now is meaningful to me as well. And I value authenticity. And as you say, if I were to kind of slough off to some sort of theism in order to find comfort, that would be inauthentic to me. And that would increase my anxiety, and that would actually not be comforting to me. there is one study which seems to suggest that kind of along those lines of the certainty of things, that people who are pretty solidly Christian or Jewish or Muslim, when tragedy happens, they stick within that space of things. They don't necessarily wander off to other traditions or move away from it altogether. Same thing with people who are pretty, as you say, atheist 24/7. That's how I experience the world as well, or agnostic, just sort of solid in their skepticism. When tragedy happens, we tend to find some way to cope with it and make meaning from it. But people who are nominally Christian, when tragedy happens, instead of pulling away from their Christianity, actually pull further into their Christianity. It oddly does not go the other way around. People who might be nominally secular don't get pulled into a secular space further. They tend to get pulled back in towards the tradition that they were raised into. What I think you're pointing to is a gap, not because it doesn't exist, but because we haven't intentionally tried to fill it. And that is a part of my work, honestly, is figuring out how to fill that gap for secular folk. I would love to write a book about that.
I was wondering how you feel ritual fits into that. I'm not comfortable with ritual myself, but there are things I do that I think of as ritual. I'm like making the bed in the morning. It's mathematically precise. I enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's the same thing, or is that just OCD?
Need more reinforcement for your quality of life.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think ritual does play into it. Alex, I can imagine a point where you might get to a point where physically, or you're just not able to make the bed the way you want, and you would experience some displeasure in the world at that space of things.
There have been days like that, but it's not too depressing.
Yeah. So I can imagine that ritual provides you comfort, and I would consider that kind of a religious-y experience for you. Same thing if you go to the same coffee shop every day, and you see the same people and you might not have a very deep connection with them, but they know your coffee order. That's a ritual that has some sort of community component to it. If you were to lose that significantly, I can imagine that might create some discomfort in somebody's life. So I think there is some ritual to that, and there is often, when working with patients, some reframing of those rituals to kind of yeah, my bed making is often informed by chaos theory as well. Yeah, I think there's often reframing of rituals, finding new ways to live into those rituals when they are start to be taken away from us. I think there's also conversations then around larger conversations around identity in there as well. Not that making a bed is a key component to your identity, Alex, but there are certain rituals and certain things that we do that are, if regular exercise is a ritual that you do, and that's a key component of how you kind of structure your day and your life, and you feel good and healthy when that exercise is taken away from you because of some physical ailment, whether chronically or briefly, that decreases your quality of life, your satisfaction with the world. That creates some sort of suffering that needs to be worked out and reframed and re-explored in different ways. And honestly, that's a bit of what the chaplains do in the hospital, across religious traditions, is in the midst of that initial struggle of things. We don't work with people long term. We may see people once or twice, maybe 3 times if we're really lucky in the hospital. But it is often sort of starting that conversation, that reframing of their experience, the changing of the narrative, starting to tell different stories about themselves that they can find comfort in, and that piece of things. Larry's hand is up.
Yeah, Larry.
Yes. I'm not quite sure how to frame this question, but I want to talk, if you have anything to say about this idea of having an omnipresent God, sort of a big brother, father figure who is constantly present in your life, how that plays into loneliness is a major problem in our culture. Quite aside from community, how that idea of having constant presence in your life, other people around, plays into that. But also, isn't there some evidence that that sense of being constantly surveyed into how people are more moral or ethical or lawful? I would just be interested in if you have any comments on that idea.
Yeah. That last half is actually really easy to answer. Larry, the research actually shows there is no difference about whether or not one believes in a big brother overwatching God and one's morality. Believing that God is watching over your shoulder and possibly punishing you does not make one more moral than somebody who doesn't. To the issue of the divine, though, and loneliness, I don't know. I know that I have worked with many theistic patients who have found comfort from their own understanding of the world, saying that they are not, like, God is with them in the suffering. That's not the big brother necessarily piece of things, but they feel all alone in the world because of what's going on with their particular illness or the particular trauma. Sometimes people's partners of decades dies tragically and unexpectedly, and they have no other real community, and they've lost their thing, and they feel all alone. And in that space, I have had patients find comfort for them naming that God is with them in that space. They're not really alone for them. Now, how does that play out long term? I'm not sure. How does that play out? I don't know of any research in particular that shows that connects the idea of a sort of big brother, father God, and loneliness. I could speak anecdotally that I have had many experiences with patients who have felt lonely in this earth, but have found community or comfort from the idea that God was with them in suffering. And that got them through another day.
Okay. The last speaker, that discussion, the idea of morals came up. I find that where do morals come from in terms of how people act? I've experienced various religious people from various religions. I've also experienced, and I would call even humanist, that can be very venomous. So where do morals come from?
My cheeky response is hell if I know. But it depends on each individual. I think if you look at sociologists, work and things, there does seem to be some sort of human social need for belonging and sort of some sort of evolutionary advantage to us moving together, which can lead some theories that might lead to sort of the evolution of morals as a community. But really, each community is going to set up their own morals differently based on different things, and often each person sets up their own morals in different, from a different foundation. For me, I try to live by the maxim of do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And that requires some empathy and deep listening. The empathy is sort of the foundation for my morals. I think humanism would argue the same thing. The Third Humanist Manifesto points to social need and sort of our interconnectedness as a sort of foundation for morals from humanism, but it's purposely it is purposely vague because that's going to be manifested for each person in a different way. That doesn't mean that all morals are equal. I think if we look to what encourages human thriving versus human lack of thriving, I think that if we look in those spaces of things and find what causes us to thrive and live better, that we're probably on a good moral track. But humanism in general would argue that morals are relative and evolving.
So I had another comment, another observation or question, I guess. And it involves the different thinking of secularists and religious people, and those terms are a little ill-defined. But my impression is a lot of people believe their religion because they're part of a group, and it's kind of a group loyalty thing. And also it may be to an extent that they don't trust their own reasoning enough to criticize the people around them. And I think we trust our reasoning more than that, and we're willing to question that. And that seems arrogant at first, but I keep thinking the conclusion we reach is that the universe wasn't made for us. We can't change the course of hurricanes by asking nicely. And if the tides rise 50 feet, half of Florida might disappear.
Yeah.
And you can't argue that God wouldn't let that happen to us.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of humility, I think, that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I especially there is, Michel Foucault would argue that it's kind of social construction, right? And we are born into our culture and our community, and that kind of creates our religion. If you're born in a conservative Christian home, you're going to be introduced to conservative Christianity. You're likely going to be a conservative Christian. It takes a certain arrogance, to deconstruct from that, a willingness to kind of move away from that with your own reasoning. I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, I mean, nature is ambivalent. Doesn't care. The universe doesn't care. I think that there is for me a beautiful peacefulness to kind of accepting the ambivalence of the universe, sort of a stoic acceptance of those things we cannot control.
Oded, I see your hand up.
Okay. We believe that atheism is based on science and reality and logic. Now we have a new scientific tool called AI, artificial intelligence. that's based upon a big database of human. Can we use AI machine to describe what is moral and what is ethical and what is not?
My short answer, Odette, is currently not, because all AI is programmed by a human being. Even the most intelligent human being is, or even the most intelligent AI is at the whims of its original programmer. And the algorithms that go into that are inherently flawed. I mean, there's all sorts of research, evidence right now that shows that at least the way AI is currently manifested, because it's of the way of who created it, that it can be, face recognition can be racist.
Okay,
And face recognition is at the core of recognizing emotions, which means that it's at the core of empathy. So can you be racist? Can you create a racist AI and expect it to be empathetic and form some sort of morals? I would argue not. So unless we can get to a point where AI is contained, I don't know. My skepticism of AI is also the hyper-rationalism and utilitarianism doesn't really, to my mind anyway, it doesn't satisfy the calculus does not satisfy me when it starts trying to weigh in sort of the individual suffering and grief.
Yeah, so you believe that if you make our AI system as perfect as possible, it will be still humane, or is something that you will never be able to do it?
Speaking from my own limited understanding of things, it's coming from some sort of human foundation, so it is inherently flawed. I don't know that I would call it human or humane, but my experience with transhumanism and that sort of thing, that is outside of my general scope of practice and curiosity. But I think it's a valid question. I mean, it's a question worth exploring.
Because I say that what I hear is being with no religion, you rely on science only. But here you find that the science cannot support even the simple way of what is moral. And moral is
I think
our being as a human.
My current summary of my position of things on that space of things is that science without empathy is not valuable. Empathy without science is dangerous.
But science without empathy is also dangerous.
Yeah,
but
I describe it as not valuable. Science without empathy is pathology. I mean, it's a purely rational being without any sort of empathy is what psychologists would label as a psychopath.
Because it seems to me sometimes when you have belief in good and scientific science are not contradicted, it can work hand in hand.
Fair.
And is the issue, there's room for religion and there's room for science to be coexist.
Yeah, I don't think you need to throw away, if you're talking religion as a theistic framework of things, yeah, I think you don't need to throw away theism to be scientific necessarily, but it is neither, I would say, do you need to be theistic to be particularly religious, is kind of my argument of things. I'm trying to advocate for secular religious practice.